Hey everyone, and welcome to the 10th part of my tutorial series and the first new addition to it. This time we will focus on the importance of combined arms. This is probably the first thing you will have to learn on your own by playing. Just watching other people doing it will only get you so far, because the situation is never the same. But before I get into it, I want to mention something important. While most of it goes for 1 versus 1 as well, this part here is mostly focused on team games, since you should not really start with 1 versus 1s if you are new. But especially the point values I mentioned later can be much different from what you see in 1 versus 1 games. So, let's get into it. The basic concept of combined arms is that you never attack with only one type of unit. Even two types of units will only work out in small skirmishes on the flanks. If you spam only one or two types of units, you can get punished very easily and it might be a very frustrating experience for you. Here you can see what I mean. As you can see, I am attacking with lots of infantry squads and their transports. Now look at what just a few medium tanks are doing to them. As you can see, they get killed very easily without doing any harms to the enemy tanks. Okay, let's spam tanks this time. And here we can see an ATGM coming at us, and we can't even spot it. And there's an anti-tank helicopter coming, picking off the tanks one by one. You could repeat this with basically any type of unit, but I think you get the point. So, what basics should you cover if you defend or attack an important front line? Besides tanks and infantry, of course. Well, first of all, scouts. It is very important to see what your enemy has in terms of units when attacking or defending. If your enemy has tanks standing in a hedgerow, you might not even be able to spot it. So, for defending, take a couple of infantry scouts and put them in bushes or towns in the first row. As for attacking, it is always good if you can sneak an infantry scout in a bush or a town at the front line, but what you can also do is sending a few scout tanks or vehicles right with their tanks. They may not have that great optics but are plentiful and can act as fire support as well. Helicopters are always a good choice, just be careful not to go too deep into the enemy anti-air net, as they can easily die that way. Next up is anti-air. Helicopters can do an extreme amount of damage and kill all your tanks within a minute. However, they can die just as easily to a single anti-air unit that does not even cost half as much. The same goes more or less for planes. So, rule of thumb is you should have at least around 100 points of anti-air at your main front line. Don't be afraid to buy another anti-air vehicle if your enemy seems to spam planes. It is always good to go for a unit that is more helicopter focused and the second one being more plane focused. But 100 points should be the minimum no matter whether you attack or defend. Also, always keep an eye out whether your anti-air unit has a radar or not. If you are already somewhat familiar with the game, then try to always have your radar AA, short for anti-air, turned off and only turn it on when there are planes or helicopters without a seaplane in the area. This is a much safer way than turning your radar AA off when you see a seaplane, because that can be too late sometimes. But if you are fairly new to the game, then don't get confused by all the talk about seat and radar. And last but by no means least, the fire support. Sometimes your tanks are already your fire support, or your infantry comes in transports that act as such. Depending on what deck you play, your infantry might be a lot weaker than your enemies, and you have to rely on fire support to kill the infantry. The best way is to use them behind your infantry. Let the enemy infantry shoot at your infantry and basically use them as meat shields, literally, for your cheap but plentiful vehicles. Good example for these kind of vehicles are the East German BMP-1, Marder 1, BP2s or CV90 when it comes to transports, the M36, M163CS or the Centurion AVRE when it comes to vehicles. There is also the BMPT, which is basically a tank with loads of anti-infantry weapons slapped on it. Fire support can also come in the form of artillery, like mortars, howitzers or MLRS. They should be easy to use, just make sure that you do not hit your own infantry or walk into your fire, as the shells have some travel time of course. You might think I forgot something, planes and helicopters. Well, I somewhat have, but helicopters are usually not necessary for the basics of defending or attacking. And planes can be very situational, and you need to roughly know how strong the enemy AA net is in order to get value out of them. That is something that I can't teach you in just a few minutes. You will figure that out by yourself over time, but here are a few tips. If you or your team have several bombers or ground support planes, then use them at the same time to both cover a bigger area and to quote-unquote overload the enemy anti-air net, as there are too many planes to deal with at once. And the second tip, do not spam planes if you are behind in ground control or just got pushed back hard. It is not a good idea to use them when you are currently losing, as they might get a few kills, but if you have no units to push up with, or too few units, then you will achieve nothing in the end and might even lose your expensive plane. So that basically sums it up, and ideally attacks should then look like this. But of course, like I said in the opening, every situation is different, which is why I can't tell you how exactly it should look like, but can only give you some examples. Nonetheless, I hope it helps you. I thank you once again very much for watching, and I see you next time.